I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
Welcome to Curious by Nature. I'm Jessica Johnson from Newswise. Communicating science isn't just about sharing great research. It's about helping people understand it, trust it, and see why it matters. In this episode, we're bringing our speakers back together for a Q&A where they answer audience questions and discuss practical strategies based on the research presentations from our Are You Talking to Me webinar. Joining the panel are Ella McCarthy, co-founder of Cyburst and former communications specialist at Australian National University, Dr. Will Grant, associate professor at the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science, Dr. Isabel Freiling, assistant professor of communication at the University of Utah and responsible AI fellow, and Shelley Wunder-Smith, director of research communications at Georgia Tech. Together, they answer questions, share practical tips for communicating science more effectively, and discuss how researchers can better connect with the people they want to reach. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, be sure to check it out. It features the research presentations that inspired today's discussion and provides great background for the questions you'll hear on this episode. To start off the conversation, I'd like to ask you, from the perspective of a university research communications team, what does it look like to move from audience, in quotes, as a general concept to audience as an actual editorial decision?
Thank you, everybody, and hello. This is something that my team and I have been talking about really for the last year and a half. And I've been at Georgia Tech in this role for about 2.5 years. And when I first got here, the thing that I observed about the content that my team is producing was it was still a little bit too technical. And so we really worked toward things like plain language and good headlines, applying some of the smart brevity principles that Axios has really developed. And then with everything that happened last year with the federal administration making cuts to research and the growing skepticism of higher ed and, with the public, we realized that we really needed to be diving in more deeply to who our audiences are and what do they really care about and what does reaching them mean and what does success look like. And so we've really been talking about how to frame stories, to frame social media, to frame magazine ads that are based on our stories, things like that, based on who we are trying to reach and what we want them to do as a result of it.
Research communicators often say they're writing for the general public. Is that ever useful, or does it usually obscure the real audience? And what do we lose when we try to create that one-size-fits-all science communication product?
This is what I really appreciated about Ella and Will and Isabel's papers, really pushing to move beyond kind of the general public. I think that is a useful guardrail. One of the things that my team and I talk about is I think AP, the Associated Press, has their reader level at like 8th grade. So are we going to keep that in mind when we are writing something? But it has to be deeper than that. And so it drives decisions about how we frame something, whether we do it as a story or we do it just as like a series of social media posts. We have to think about the institutional priorities too, but then what is the actual audience for that? Because sometimes, we get a request from a leader to do something and we have to dig into what is this really intended to accomplish? Who do you want it to reach? And if it's, say, coastal Georgia, which is where Georgia Tech is located in the state of Georgia. It's a red state. It's very rural outside Atlanta and very conservative. So if we want to reach the coast of Georgia, we need a reason for those readers to care about what we're doing. It can't just be, oh, I think this would be good to put this out there.
It can be so difficult to get media coverage on things, in particular research that you might have. And then if you have to have the audience, be so specific, that makes it sometimes a little bit more challenging. Can you say anything about that?
I mean, I think I would just say try things. That's kind of what we've done. And actually, one thing that I can talk about is our Research for Real Life campaign, which is a research impact campaign showcasing how Georgia Tech's research has touched the lives of actual individuals in a particular community or a particular demographic. And we started developing this as a result of everything that was going on the federal level with all the funding, the research funding cuts last year. And we realized that we, like so many other higher ed institutions, needed to be communicating the value of our research in a more immediate and relatable way. And one of the things that we did for that was we built a synthetic audience using AI. And because we specifically wanted to target state lawmakers and other policymakers at the state, which again, I'll remind everybody is conservative, rural. They tend to think of Georgia Tech as kind of an elite school in a blue dot, and that we don't do anything that touches the lives of their constituents. So we built this AI synthetic audience where we took publicly available data and voting records, education, all things like that. And I will just say I did not build it. A colleague of mine who is brilliant built this. But we use that to test our messaging against what AI said our audience might care about. And we were looking for a bipartisan approach. So, were there ways of finding a tagline like research for real life that would be impactful for people who, all across the political spectrum, regardless of where you lived in Atlanta or, sorry, Georgia. So we took that, we ran our messaging through it, and then had a discussion about the results. And we picked something that was not the AI's top choice, but, again, keeping humans in the loop, we went with what we felt was best. And then we took it to, various leaders like our federal relations team and asked them for feedback. And it was useful. And I will say that I know a lot of comms shops at higher ed institutions are small. So this was something that was built by one person and using a deep research ChatGPT license.
Isn't there a dynamic tension between having enough, I guess, resources to craft a different message for every platform audience and just using the same message and letting the platform deciding your audience by default?
So, like, for example, for the Research for Real Life campaign, one of the things we do is, what do we care most about in terms of who do we care most about and what's the most effective way to reach them? So it might be that, all of the social media posts are the same because we're not trying to put a nuanced focus on our messages for social, but we want to target a magazine ad if we're targeting lawmakers. Like, how do we want to do that? And so, yeah, you do have to be strategic based on what you're able to do.
I think it's really fascinating hearing your perspective on this. I wanted to, because obviously you would be crafting stories to work with the different audiences. I loved how you said, working with the coast in Georgia there, or thinking about lawmakers and things like that. How do you help the scientists in reverse to understand the audiences that might be potential for their research?
One of the things that we found as a result, again, going back to last year and all the federal cuts, our faculty, our scientists and researchers kind of realized, oh, I really do need to be connecting with the public so they know where their tax dollars are going for this research, and um, that it's a must have. It's not a nice to have. And, if they want their funding to continue. And so we really start now, like when my team gets assigned a story and they're working with a researcher to, craft the narrative around it, they start out by saying, this is what we're trying to do with this. This is who we're trying to write it for. It can be hard for researchers to not want to use the technical terms for everything, to want to include every single nuance of their detail, which of course is very important for their field and that audience. But then we just try to coach them from the outset about what is going to happen with the work and what we're trying to do with it. It does help to say, if we write it this way, it's more likely to be covered by the media. Some researchers are motivated by that. And just sort of tangentially, one of the things we're doing at Georgia Tech is working on building like public engagement training for our faculty, our PhD students, things like that, so that they are able to think about their research that way.
That made me think of what we have here at Utah. A colleague of mine is starting a STEM ambassador program that's about training STEM scientists about how you can engage the public in your research, where they choose a specific audience and then come up with an event. And it's a cohort that they follow, I think, over a year. And then they really think through the different parts of the communication, including the audience in different ways. And I mean, it already attracts scientists who are more interested in that, of course, but it's a great way to like have some more education among scientists about how we can best communicate findings. And I saw a question in the chat about personas, and I was also thinking about personas. So let me just ask that question. Does your model use basically different personas as your synthetic audience? And also, did you feed some science communication literature into the model to specifically consider, or was it just generally searching the internet?
Okay, so no, we did not feed science communication literature into that, but going back, maybe that's something that we should go back and add. The synthetic audience really is a bunch of personas kind of smushed together. And we did also build in different groups that could be included in the message testing. So faculty, prospective PhD students, prospective undergraduates, um, staff, even, if we need to test messaging across the institute staff. So it's just a different way of looking at things like personas.
Whoever would like, please jump in and respond. Charles Blue, I'm going to share your question. For public speaking, I now recommend going beyond defining an audience to put yourself in the audience. Imagine you're among the demographic you're talking to. What would make this talk exciting, engaging, and rewarding? What would put you to sleep? Does this translate to writing in other formats?
Having empathy for your audience is integral, trying to understand them as richly as we can. And I think one step for that absolutely is trying to imagine, okay, what would it be like if I was that person receiving that communication, whether I'm sitting in a lecture theatre, whether I'm sitting in a Zoom presentation now, or I'm attempting to read some writing. So I think, yes, I think that absolutely translates to all of the formats. Now, it's not complete because our ability to empathize and imagine someone else's life does require a little bit more than just, everyone is living in different ways. They're living in different contexts. They have different goals that they're trying to achieve that day or in their life. But I think that's the start. We should always attempt to try and empathize with where people are, what they're doing, what they're trying to achieve. And only then can we go anywhere with our communication.
For Charles, when you're thinking about putting yourself in the audience, for me, what that is bringing up is that you're putting yourself into kind of this area of play where perhaps some richer and more implicit understandings of audience are kind of able to come to life because you're not just thinking of who is my audience in terms of, say, demographics. So when you're putting yourself in the audience, all of a sudden you're touching on so many of the categories that our paper conceptualized. So you're very aware of your own demographics. You're probably really aware of how dynamic you as an individual would be in that situation, of your embodied nature in that physical space, in that room, in that online fourth space. You would know about the interaction dependencies. You'd know about your values. So I think that's a really great recommendation. I can understand how many unlocks that perspective is giving for you to help make your science communication more rewarding. So I can definitely see a lot of what we spoke about mirrored here as well. So I love it. I might use that in the future. I think that's great.
I'll go on to Alberta Joseph Alexander's question. Is public engagement part of their faculty tenure?
There was another study that where we interviewed researchers at a land grant university where some might have an extension. That job is about you communicate with people in your state. And so for them, there's more expectations that you actually do that public engagement. But when you have a tenure track job with no extension appointment, then it's typically not a formal part of your tenure and promotion. So it's something that, of course, if you do public engagement, takes time, but it takes time away from other things that are rewarded more in your tenure and promotion. So how universities are structured and what kind of appointment you have can totally be a barrier to public engagement.
Do you have any difficulty justifying to leadership that you may have gotten few hits on a message, but it was with a critical audience when they usually want lots and lots of hits, period, as their measure of your success?
Yes. So, but I will say that this is, we've been fortunate. Our VP of communications here at Georgia Tech came from the CDC, where she led basically national communications during the COVID pandemic. So that has given her a lot of credibility with particularly our upper leadership here at Georgia Tech. And it has been a process of educating them about good communication principles, good science communication principles. She loves to go back to the science. And since our leadership, they're researchers, engineers, scientists themselves, they really respond to that information, the data. And so we are more easily able to have those conversations about this was still a success, even though, we didn't go viral for whatever that is.
Your research shows that audiences are plural rather than a single general public. For medical news organizations that serve clinicians, students, researchers, and lay readers simultaneously, what editorial framework would you recommend for deciding who a story should primarily be written for, and when is it better to create separate versions for different audiences?
This is the integral question that science communicators, public information officers will face, that you have limited resources and you have a plurality of audiences that you need to reach. And I think, what you've got straight away there, you have defined a few categories. And I think students, clinicians, researchers, lay readers, it's great that you've got those in your mind already. I think, of course, dividing your resources to try to achieve as many of them as you can, you may find, I think, that well written or well produced material can cover a few of them. We might find that clinicians, researchers, and students are actually going to be covered by similar sorts of material. Lay readers, I think that is a different set. And I think that does require potentially even ask for a dedicated strategy. You might be working on material where you're saying, okay, I actually want to talk to the consumer community of people with diabetes or something like that. And that's worth investing in. Don't assume they are the same as the clinicians, but also careful of assuming they have low knowledge. They might be really high knowledge consumers there, just with different technical approaches. Again, it comes back to those goals of what are you trying to achieve with your wider research and communication.
I assume that also, like, sometimes you can maybe be going for a very specific audience and it almost maybe accidentally goes viral and reaches a huge other audience that you weren't really expecting it to reach, and vice versa, maybe. Thank you all so much. We are just at our time, and I really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate all of your time and generous information that you've offered here and the work that you've done and sharing both that research and how it can inform the practice.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.